Sela of Whitestone was already at the stone before the first gray of dawn. She had not slept much. She rarely slept much in the week after a campaign, when the parchments came down from the Chamberlain's lodge in the hand of Elder Larson, and the names on the parchments were already a shape in her chest before her chisel edge had even touched the slate. She had read the latest list at the small wooden table in her stone hut at midnight, the lamp low between her hands, and she had read each name twice, once with her eye, and once with her finger laid flat on the parchment over the letters as though to memorize the place of each man on her own skin. There were 17 on this list. She came out of the iron door of the stone hut into the inner courtyard of Heidr in the pre-dawn cold, and she walked the 8 paces between her door and the foot of the great name stone. Her boots made a small, soft sound on the worn flagstones. The air smelled of pine smoke from the kitchen vents and the faint, older smell of stone dust that hung over the courtyard always. She stopped at the foot of the stone. She laid her right hand flat against the slate, low, at the level of her own knee. She did this every morning. Her grandmother had taught it to her at 12. A carver did not begin a day's work without putting her hand on the stone and saying, with her hand and not with her voice, that she was here, that she remembered the ones already cut, and that the ones not yet cut would not be cut quickly. She held her hand on the slate for a count of 20. Then she stepped back. She turned her head a little to the side, the way she did when she was estimating the next clear patch of stone. The name's stone was carved with names from a hand's breadth above the ground to a hand's breadth below the top, and the carvings ran in tight, even lines, and the next clear patch was at the height of her own collarbone, on the 3rd line down from the most recent campaign. 48 finger widths of clear slate. Enough for 19 names if she carved tight, enough for 16 if she carved generous. She would carve generous. The 17th name would have to roll over to a fresh line. She walked back to the iron door of her hut, and she pushed it open, and she went in. Her stone hut was small, a long wooden workbench against the slit-windowed wall, a chisel rack above the bench with 3 hands' breadths of clean iron tools, a small iron brazier in the corner with last night's coals still warm under the ash, a straw pallet at the back, a waist-high block of pale white practice stone in the far corner with a single slow vertical line carved into the lower edge. Mira's first work at 9, a long row of small clay oil jars on the shelf above the brazier, the smell of stone dust and warm iron, and the small, thin smell of the oil she kept for the chisels. Mira was asleep on the straw pallet at the back, curled with her knees up under a brown wool blanket and her 2 dark braids pulled across her shoulder. Sela did not wake her. The girl had been up half the night holding the candle while Sela read the list. Sela took her gray leather work apron off the hook. She buckled it from collarbone to mid-thigh. She slipped the chest strap over her shoulder and seated the 3 small chisel pouches at her right hip. She tied the wide leather wristband on her right wrist and tightened it with her teeth at the leather end, the small, efficient movement her grandmother had taught her at 13. She slid the small, soft pouch of fine, pale sand onto the leather strap at her belt. She lifted her grandmother's ashwood maul off the bench. The grip was smooth from 60 years of use. She picked the medium chisel from the chest strap. She walked back out into the courtyard. A first thin gray of the dawn was just beginning to touch the upper edge of the great name stone. The slate at the top went from black to the color of pewter. The lower 3/4 of the stone was still in shadow. Her work line, the 3rd line down from the last campaign, was still in the deep shadow. She stood at the stone. She laid the parchment flat on a little iron-bound stool she kept at the foot of the slate, the corners weighted with 4 small, pale stones from her practice block. She knelt at the level of her work line. She took the medium chisel in her right hand, the maul in her left. She looked at the first name on the parchment. She said low, just above the level of the stone, the way she had said every name she had ever cut. Even Ardal, son of Petrin. Then she set the chisel edge to the slate at the height of her collarbone, and she began the eye. She worked slowly. A name carved fast was a name forgotten fast. Her grandmother had told her that, and her grandmother had been right. Her first letter took 1/4 of an hour, the vertical stroke first, with the fine chisel turned toward the grain, then the small upper serif, then the small lower serif. Then she ran her thumb across the cuts to feel the edges, and she ran her fine pale sand into the cuts to bring up the white of the new stone against the dark. She moved on to the V. By the time she had finished the IVEN, she had been at the stone for 1 hour. She stood up to ease the long muscle of her right thigh. She let the maul rest at the foot of the stool. She reached up and laid the back of her right hand against her own forehead, the way she did when she had been at the stone an hour, to remind her hand that her hand was a hand and not the chisel. She took the parchment up from the stool. She read the second name. She said it out loud, Halvor Tess, son of Tama. She knelt again. By full sunrise she had 3 names cut. Mira came out of the hut at the 2nd hour after dawn, blinking, her hair still in its braids, the smaller version of the leather apron only half buckled. The girl took the small wooden bucket from the bench by the door and went to fill it from the courtyard pump, and came back with the water and set it at the foot of the practice stone. For Sela's chisel cooling. The girl lit the brazier from the night's coals and put a small iron pan on it for the porridge. The girl came out and stood at Sela's elbow without speaking and watched her work the 4th name. The girl had been watching her work for 4 years. Sela said without turning, Lo, Ivan, Halvar, Toma, and now Bran, son of Elric. Mira said, Lo, Bran. Sela cut the B. At the 3rd hour after dawn, the iron door of the inner courtyard opened, and a man came in. Sela did not turn her head. Sela's hands kept on the stone. The long downstroke of the R, the upper hook, the lower hook, the final heel, because her grandmother had told her that a carver did not stop at a footstep. A carver stopped at the end of a letter. Always at the end of a letter. Mira turned her head. Mira's small body went still in the way of a girl who had grown up under a chisel roof and knew the weight of a king's footstep before she knew the king's face. Mira whispered, Lo, Sela. Sela said, Lo, I know. She finished the heel of the R. Then she set the chisel down on the stool and the maul beside it, and she stood up. She turned at her own pace. She did not hurry. A carver did not hurry, even for a king. He stood 3 paces from her. He was tall. He was not in the iron circlet. He was not in the state cloak. He was in his charcoal wool cloak, lined deep burgundy, the plain leather overvest with the single iron 3-spire token at the breast, the dark green wool tunic, the soft, tall leather boots. His hair was loose tied at the nape with a plain leather cord. His dark beard was trimmed close to the jawline. His dark hazel eyes, gold-flecked brown, went from her face to the stone, to her chisel and back. Behind him, at the iron door of the courtyard, lay the dark gray wolf with the pale belly. Sorin. The wolf did not come into the courtyard. The wolf laid his head on his forepaws at the edge of the threshold and watched. He said low, Sela of Whitestone. She said, Your Grace. He said, Forgive me. She did not understand for a breath what he was asking forgiveness for. She had never spoken to him before. She had seen him at 3 state functions in the past 5 years, twice in the courtyard at the burning of a captain's roll, once at the year-end festival when his cloak had brushed her shoulder in passing. He had not spoken to her then. He said, I have come to find a name. She said, Whose? He said, My captain, Aaron of Hael. He has not yet come on the rolls. I came to ask whether you have his name yet. She said, He is not on this list. He nodded once. His face did not change, but the dark hazel eyes went a little darker, the way a firebed went darker when a small wind found it. He said, Then he is not yet fallen. She said, He is not on Larson's hand yet. I have only the 17. He said, May I see? She gave him the parchment from the stool. He took it in his 2 hands. He read it slowly. His lips moved on the names. He did not skip any. When he was done, he handed it back without a word. He said, Even Ardle. He served at the South Crossing under Captain Tess. A good young man. His mother is at the wool yard. She said, Yes, Your Grace. He said, Halver Tess. The captain's nephew. She said, Yes. He said, You knew. She said, I read the lists when they come. I keep the names. It is the work. He looked at the great name stone. He did not look at her for a moment. He let his eyes climb the stone. The rows and rows of cut names, the pale dust of fine sand still in the most recent cuts, the faint gray-white where her chisel had bitten. He laid the flat of his right hand against the stone at the height of his own chest, the way she laid hers at the height of her own knee in the mornings. He held his hand there for a count of 12. He said, low, to the stone, May I sit? She said, On the carver's bench inside, Your Grace, Mira will bring you water. He said, I will sit on the courtyard step. I do not want to be inside. She said, As Your Grace wills. He went and sat on the wide, flat stone of the inner step, his back to the wall, his knees up, his cloak pooled around his boots. Soren the wolf came across the courtyard at a quiet trot and laid himself across the king's feet like a second cloak. The king laid one hand on the wolf's neck. He said, low, across the courtyard, Carve. I will not interrupt. She knelt back down at the stone. She picked up the chisel. She laid the edge to the slate. She said, Lo, Bran, son of Aelric. She finished the N. He stayed on the courtyard step the whole of that morning. She did not speak to him again. She did not need to. A carver who turned her head at every motion was a carver whose chisel slipped, and her chisel did not slip. She worked through Bran and through Toma and through the half letters of the 5th name on the list, and the morning sun climbed above the line of the slate and fell across the back of her neck and warmed the small fine hairs at the nape of her braid, and the stone went warm under her left hand where she steadied her cuts, and behind her on the wide flat step of the inner door, a king of North-Marsh sat with his cloak pooled around his boots and his dark gray wolf laid across them, and did not speak. At noon, Mira came out of the hut with 2 wooden bowls. Mira took one bowl across the courtyard to the king and set it on the step beside him. The girl said something low. Sela could not hear it across the 8 paces of stone, but she saw the king nod once and lift the bowl in both hands. The girl came back to Sela with the second bowl and set it on the iron-bound stool beside the parchment. Sela laid the chisel down. She laid them all down. She stood up. She took the bowl in both hands the way her grandmother had taught her. Both hands, every meal, even broth. because a carver lived by her hands, and a carver thanked her hands at every bowl by holding the bowl with both of them. She drank. Her broth was barley, with the small wisps of wild thyme Mira liked to throw in late. It was hot. It was good. Across the courtyard, the king drank his bowl with both hands. He had not asked the question. She thought he had been told the rule by Larson. The chamberlain knew everyone's small rules, and the chamberlain was nothing if not exact. When she had finished the bowl, she set it back on the stool. She wiped the corners of her mouth with the back of her left hand. She knelt back at the stone. She picked up the chisel. She said, "Lo, Idravin, daughter of Mara." She cut the E. He sat through her work the rest of the day. He did not eat again. He did not move, except to lay a hand on Søren's neck once or twice, and to shift the angle of his back against the warm stone of the wall. At the 3rd hour after noon, the chamberlain Larson came into the courtyard with a folded parchment in his hand. The chamberlain's old gray wolf bark walked at his left side with his nose just below his hand. The chamberlain stopped at the iron door, saw the king on the step, and bowed without surprise. The chamberlain came across the courtyard at his own pace. Larson laid the folded parchment on the iron-bound stool beside the bowl Sela had used and the open list of 17. He said, "Lo, a second list, Sela, 3 more from a forester's company at the High Pass. They came down today." Sela said, "Their names." Larson said, "Halvor Drun, Tem of 3 Pines, and a young man called only Bowen. His mother does not know the rest of the name. The captain says they will write her." Sela said, "Bowen of 3 Pines, then, with that name." Larson said, "As you say." Larson laid his old veined hand on Sela's shoulder for a single breath, the only touch he had ever permitted himself to her in her 13 years of carving, and only on a list day, only after a list. And then he turned and walked away across the courtyard. He stopped at the king's step. He bowed. The king nodded. The chamberlain went out by the iron door. He did not stand. Sela carved. Outside, the light went from white to gold to amber, and from amber to pale red. At the fall of dusk, she had finished 6 names of the 17. She could not work the chisel by lamplight in the courtyard. The stone took the light wrong, and the cuts went uneven. And so, at dusk, she stopped. She set the chisel and the maul on the stool. She stood up. She rolled her shoulders 1 slow turn each way to ease the long muscles. She rolled her wrists. She drew her right thumb across the sand pouch at her belt to clean the edge of her cutting hand. She turned to the step. He was still there. She walked across the courtyard. She stopped at the foot of the step with her hands at her sides. She said, "Lo, your grace, the light is gone. I will resume in the morning," he said. "How long for the 17? She said. "1 hour for each name," he said. 17 hours of carving, she said. "Carved across 3 days," he said, and the parchment Larson brought. She said 3 more, 20 in total, across 4 days. He said, "You carve slow?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "A name carved fast is a name forgotten fast." He looked at her for a long count. Then he said, "Lo, your grandmother used to say that." She said, "She did." He said, "My mother quoted her." Sela was quiet for a count of 3. She said, "Your mother knew my grandmother." He said, "Your grandmother carved my mother 12 years ago. The wasting fever." She finished the name 2 hours before she sat down at the foot of the stone and did not get up. "My mother and your grandmother went out of the world the same week. My mother was carved by your grandmother's last hand. I have always thought of that." Sela said, "Your grace." He said, "I am sorry. I have not been to the stone in 5 years." She said, "You came today." He said, "I came today because my captain, Corvan Hael, rode out 2 days ago and hasn't come back. He may not be on the rolls when the rolls come. I came in case the chamberlain had brought you a name I had not yet been told. She said, He is not on Larson's hand. Not yet. He said, Then there is hope. She said, Yes, your grace. He stood up. Soren, the dark gray wolf, rose with him and stretched, the way a big alpha stretched, the long, slow drop of the front shoulders, and then walked at his man's heel as the king came down the wide flat stone of the inner step. He said, May I bring you bread tomorrow? She did not answer for a moment. The old crown tribute, the king bringing bread to the carver. She had read of it in her grandmother's notebook. She had not seen it offered in her own life. She said, Bread is the old crown tribute of the carvers. He said, Yes. She said, A carver does not refuse bread from the king. He said, I know. She said, Then yes, your grace, bread. He said, Tomorrow before light. She said, I am at the stone before light. He said, So am I on most days. I had not known you were. She said, I am. He nodded once. He said, Lo, Sela of Whitestone, before he turned. She said, Your grace. He said, You said the second list, Bowen of 3 Pines. I knew his father. His father came up with mine at Stonewatch. His father is on the upper register, on the 7th line. I touched his name once when I came to the stone for my own father 5 years back. She said, Then I will carve Bowen at his father's feet on the lower register, in the next clear line, so they will be near. He said, Lo, thank you. He went out by the iron door. Soren went after him. She stood for a count of 20 in the dusk of the courtyard. Then she walked back to her stone hut. Mira had the brazier going inside and a small iron pot of grain on the coals. The girl was kneeling at the foot of the practice stone, in the corner, sharpening Sela's medium chisel on a long, pale whetstone, the way Sela had taught her at 10. The girl did not look up. Mira said, Lo, he came back. Sela said, He came today. He had not come in 5 years. Mira said, He sat on the step the whole day. Sela said, He did. Mira said, He spoke to you when the chamberlain came. Sela said, He did. Mira said, Lo, after a long count. He has not been near the stone in 5 years. I asked Larson once. Larson said the king would not come. Sela said, He came today because his captain has not come home. Mira said, Aaron. Sela said, Aaron of Hael. Mira said, Captain Aaron was kind to me at the year end. He gave me a roasted nut from his own bowl. Sela said, He is not on the rolls. Mira said, Not yet. Sela said, Not yet. She sat at the long bench. She took her work apron off. She laid the chest strap of the chisel pouches across the bench. She laid the wide leather wristband beside the strap. She laid her grandmother's ashwood maul across the bench at the head, where it always slept. Mira brought her a bowl of grain. She ate. She did not sleep until the small hours. In the very early gray of the dawn, she heard a footstep on the courtyard flagstones outside her iron door. A single soft footstep, paused, sat down again, and she heard a small soft sound of cloth on the worn stone, and then the footstep going away. When she opened the door at first gray, there was a small, linen-wrapped loaf of fine pale bread on the flat stone of her threshold. The wrap was charcoal wool. The hem was lined deep burgundy. She knelt. She picked up the bread in both hands. She said, Lo, to no one, and to the king who was no longer there, Thank you, your grace. She brought the bread inside. She woke Mira. They ate together at the bench by the brazier. The bread was good. It was the king's own kitchen. By the time the first thin gray of the dawn touched the upper edge of the great name's stone in the courtyard outside, Sela of Whitestone was already at her work line, the medium chisel in her right hand, the maul in her left, and she said, Lo, just above the level of the stone, Bowen of 3 Pines. And she set the chisel edge to the slate at the 7th line of the upper register's lower neighbor, where his father's feet would brush his name forever. He came every morning after that. He came in the pre-dawn, a small linen-wrapped loaf in his hand, the charcoal wool cloak with the deep burgundy lining at his shoulders, Soren the dark gray wolf at his heel. He laid the loaf on the flat stone of her threshold. He did not knock. He sat on the wide flat step of the inner courtyard with his back to the wall and his knees up and his cloak pulled around his boots, and he watched her work, and he said nothing for hours at a time. Aaron of Hael did not come on the rolls. For 7 days she carved through the 17 and the 3 from the high pass and the second small list of 4 that Larson brought on the 5th morning. And at every meal, Mira brought a bowl across the courtyard to the king. And at every dusk, the king stood and bowed once and went out by the iron door. And every morning before light, there was a small loaf of pale bread on her threshold. On the 7th day, Corvan Hael came home alive. Larson sent Mira running across the courtyard at the 8th hour after dawn. Mira came with her cap in her hand and her face flushed, and she said, "Lo," before the bow she always made at her own threshold, "He is alive." The captain. He came down the south road this hour with 3 men. He is at the kitchen. He is alive. He was on the courtyard step. He was reading a small book of lists. He looked up. He did not stand. He did not weep. He was a king, and he did not weep where anyone could see, but his face went a long, quiet, still way for the count of 10, and then he closed the small book of lists, and he laid it on the step beside him. He said, "Lo, Mira, tell the kitchen I will be there in a moment." Mira bowed and went. He sat for one more breath on the step. Then he stood. He walked across the 8 paces of courtyard to the foot of the named stone where Sela was kneeling at her work line. He stopped 2 paces from her. She did not lift her chisel. She finished the heel of the letter she was on, the L of Lebec, son of Pera, and she set the chisel down and she stood up and she turned. He said, "Lo, Sela." She said, "Your grace." He said, "He is alive." She said, "I heard." He said, "I owe my next 10 years to the carver of this stone." She said, "You owe nothing, your grace." He said, "You did not have to carve his name." She said, "He was not on the rolls." He said, "You did not have to almost carve it." She did not understand for a breath what he meant. Then she did. She had spent every quiet moment between letters this last week looking at the patch of slate, 3 lines below her work line, on the lower register but at the edge of the upper, where the L for lieutenant or the C for captain might have to begin a long name. She had estimated the depth. She had estimated the width. She had measured the patch with her thumb against the chisel edge twice. She had not done it because Aaron was on a list. She had done it because every name she carved came easier if she had walked to the patch where it would go, and she had touched the patch with her thumb. And she had been doing that for a captain who had been a foster brother of a king for 2 days now. She had not told the king this. He had seen it anyway. A king who could find his 3 blood names on a stone in the dark by feel could see a carver lay her thumb on a patch of slate 3 times in a week and know what the patch was for. She said, "Lo, I am glad I will not need that patch yet." He said, "I am glad too." He stood for a count of 3. He did not move. Then he said, "May I touch the place where my father's name is?" She said, "Of course." He went around the side of the stone to the upper register. He laid the flat of his right hand on the slate at his own chest height on the 3rd line of the upper register where Corvan Hael was. He did not look at the carving. He closed his eyes. He held his hand there for a count of 40. Then he laid his hand below his father's name on the 7th line at his mother's name, Brina Hael. He held it there for a count of 40. Then he laid his hand at the highest reach of his own arm on the last line of the upper register, where his older brother was, Calder Hael. He held it there for a count of 50. She did not watch. A carver did not watch a king at his own family's names. She knelt back at her work line. She picked up the chisel. She set the edge to the slate. She did not cut yet. She waited. When he came back around the side of the stone, she said, without turning, "Lo, you found them quickly." He said, "I have found them in the dark before. The 1st month after my brother fell, I came at the 3rd hour of the night with a candle, and the candle blew out, and I found him by feel. After that, I did not need the candle." She said, "Your hand knows the stone." He said, "My hand knows 3 names on a stone of 4,000. That is not knowing the stone." She said, "It is enough, your grace." He said, "Lo, Sela." She said, "Yes." He said, "May I ask you a thing?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How did you carve your own?" She did not have to ask which her own. She had 3, her father, her mother, her brother. He had been to the stone enough times in his life, even the 5 years of staying away, to know the names of her line, because her grandmother had carved his line, and her line had carved his line for 200 years. And a king who knew the carver's stone knew the carver's names. She said, slowly, he waited. She said, my father, Sela of Whitestone, soldier, fell at Stonewatch in the same year as your father. I was 11. My grandmother carved his name. I held her chisel pouch. She said, my mother, Ina of Whitestone, weaver, died of the wasting fever the same week your mother did. I was 11 still. My grandmother carved her name. My grandmother had 3 names to carve that week. She said it was the worst week of her life. She finished my mother's name at dusk, and she came back into the hut, and she sat at this bench, and she put her 2 hands flat on the bench, and she did not speak for an hour. She said, my brother, Cason of Whitestone, fell at the South Pass when I was 19. I had been carving alone for 4 years by then. My grandmother had been 4 years dead. There was no one to carve him but me. She said, I carved him at the highest reach of my chisel arm. The patch is at the top of the lower register, where the upper register begins. He has the upper edge of his upper letters touching the lower edge of the king line that runs above. I told myself that was an accident of the patch. It was not an accident. She did not say more. He stood at her shoulder for a long count. He said, lo, I touched a name in the dark 4 years ago that I did not know was your brother's. I touched it because it was just below my brother's. I thought it must be a captain. I held my hand on it for a count of 12. I have been touching it every time I have come to the stone since. I did not know it was Cason. She did not turn. She set the chisel edge back to the slate. She said, lo, Cason Whitestone, my brother, was glad to be touched, your grace. She cut the next letter. He stood at her shoulder for a count of 20 more, and then he walked back across the 8 paces of courtyard to the wide flat step of the inner door, and he sat down with his back to the wall, and he did not speak again that day. 3 days later, he asked her hand. It was at noon. He had brought across the day's bread already. Mira was at the brazier inside heating broth. Sela had laid the chisel and the maul on the iron-bound stool to ease her right shoulder. He stood up off the step and walked across the courtyard at his slow, easy walk. He stopped 2 paces from her. Soren laid himself across the line of the doorway, ears up, watching the iron gate of the courtyard. He said, lo, may I see your hand? She said. Which? He said. The right. She held it out. He did not take it. He did not touch it. He did the thing he had done at the inn at Stonebridge once, with a different woman and a different shoulder that he had told no one of and that she would never know. He leaned a little in, and he looked. He looked at the back of her right hand, at the fine, pale chisel mark lines that ran from the second knuckle to the wrist. 3 of them. 4 of them. He looked at the small, old chisel mark scar on the inside of the right thumb, the size of a barley grain. He looked at the calluses at the base of the index finger and the second finger. He nodded once, the way he had nodded at the beer walker's shoulder, though she would never know that either. He said low, you have your grandmother's hand. She said, yes. He said, I held her hand once when I was small. She came up to the hall on a year-end. She put her right hand on my head, and I felt the line of the calluses against my hair. I remember the line. She said, your grace. He said, I will not touch yours. Sela. A carver's hand belongs to the chisel. She said, I know that, your grace. He said, I look at it because it is good work. She did not answer. He stepped back. He went and sat back on the step. She picked the chisel up. She set the edge to the slate. She did not say the next name out loud right away. She said it to herself first. She said, in the small quiet inside her head, where she said the names of her own dead, Levick, son of Hera, and then she said it out loud at the level of the stone, and she cut. In the late afternoon, a small, heavy footstep came in at the iron gate of the courtyard. It was not the chamberlain. It was a tall, fox-faced lord in a deep blue tabard with a 3-feather sigil at the breast, mail under the gambeson, a fine silver belt with a worked silver buckle, auburn-graying hair, pale gray eyes, a bronze-colored wolf at his heel that did not look at Soren. Lord Heidr. He came across the courtyard at a quicker pace than was needful. He did not bow at the king on the step until he was almost at the foot of the step itself. He bowed shallow. The king inclined his head a finger's width. Heidr said, lo, your grace, a small matter of the upper register, he said. Speak, Heidr. Heidric's pale gray eyes went past the king and landed on Sela at the stone and held there for a breath. They did not soften. He said, Speak. Heidr said, A matter for the carver also, perhaps? He said, A matter for me first. Speak. Heidr said, Lo, as your grace wills. He turned a half step away from Sela. He stood with his hands behind his back the old way. He spoke at a level she could not quite hear from the stone. The king's face did not change. The king's face went only the small, slow, narrowing way it went when he had heard a thing he did not like. When the lord had finished, the king said, Low, but at a level she could hear, We do not move names on the name stone, Heidr. Not in my reign, not in my father's, not in my grandfather's. Speak no more of it, Heidr said, As your grace wills. He bowed the half-bow, and he went out by the iron door. His bronze wolf went after him without looking at Soren. He sat back down on the step. He laid his right hand on Soren's neck, the way he did, and he closed his eyes for the count of 12. He did not look at Sela. She did not look at him. She picked the chisel up. She cut the next letter. Heidr did not let the matter go. He came back to the king at the Privy Council the next afternoon. Sela learned this later, from Mira, who learned it from a kitchen boy who had carried the king's afternoon cup of weak ale into the chamber and had stayed at the inner door an extra 2 breaths longer than he was meant to. And Heidr had stood across the long oak table from the king and had laid down a parchment, and the parchment had been a petition. Heidric's petition asked that's cousin, a captain called Garrod Melvin, who had fallen at the first siege of Stonewatch, be moved from the lower register of the Great Name Stone to the upper register where the kings of the Hael line had lain for 200 years. The petition cited an old council judgment from 110 years back when a warlord called Caro Melven had been moved up under King Anhar II. The petition asked for parity. The petition was signed by 12 lords of the Inner March. He refused the petition. He said, in the council, low and flat, and in the kitchen boy heard him, A name carved is a name kept. We do not move names. The Melvin boy lies at the lower register where his rank put him. He is not less because he is not higher. We do not move names. That is final. Heidr folded the petition. Heidr bowed. Heidr went out. Next morning, Heidr did not come to the courtyard. Next morning, 2 of Heidric's men came. They came in at the iron gate of the courtyard at the 2nd hour after dawn. They were not in tabards. They were in plain wool and leather, the way a lord's men dressed when they did not want to be seen as a lord's men. They had no swords. They had short clubs at their belts, and they had a small, iron-banded chest between them. He was on the step. He had not yet stood up to go to the war room. He had been sitting watching her work, the way he had sat for 14 days now. Soren was on his feet across the line of the doorway. Soren saw them come in. Soren rose. Both men did not see the king at first. They saw Sela at the stone, and the iron door of the stone hut behind her, half open, and the corner of the chisel rack that showed through the gap of the door. They walked across the 8 paces of courtyard at a brisk pace. They did not bow at the stone. A taller of the 2 said, Lo, you, carver. She did not turn. She finished the letter she was on. The N of Nin, daughter of Helva. She set the chisel down. She stood up. She turned. She said, Lo, yes. He said, By order of the Carvers' Guild of Heidr, you are required to come to the guild hall today and stand inspection. The guild has had report that the carving on the name's stone is below standard. Your right to carve is suspended pending. We will take your tools to the guild house and escort. She did not move. She said, Lo, there is no Carvers' Guild of Heidr. He said, There is now. His companion said, As of yesterday. She said, By whose hand? He said, By the petition of 12 lords of the Inner March, confirmed by the Lord Marshal at noon. She said, The Lord Marshal does not have the seat of the king. He said, We were not sent by the king. She said, Then you may not take my tools. He said, We are taking your tools. He stepped past her. He walked toward the iron door of the stone hut. Mira was inside. Sela's body went a little stiff. She did not move. She turned her head a fraction. She knew that if she moved fast, she would lose the small thread of patience that her grandmother had taught her, and her chisel hand would not work again that day. A carver did not act in heat. A carver acted at the end of a letter. He was at the door of the hut. A voice came from across the courtyard. It was not loud. It said, Lo, stop. He stopped. It was a voice the man knew the way every man in Heidr knew it. It was a voice that did not rise. It was a voice that had ended quarrels in the kitchen, in the smithy, in the war room. and once at a year-end festival when two boys of the inner ring had drawn knives on each other. He turned. He was on his feet. His hand was not on the hilt of his short sword. It was at his side. Soren was a pace in front of him, head low, ears flat back, the long ridge of his neck hair standing up. The dark gray wolf with the pale belly was the size of a small pony. He said low, "Step away from the door." He stepped away from the door. His companion stepped a little back. He said, "Low, lay the chest at my feet," he said. "Your Grace, we were," he said, "lay the chest at my feet." He laid the iron-banded chest at the king's feet. He said, "Lo, I have not heard of any carver's guild of Heidr." He did not answer. He said, "Lo, there is none." He did not answer. He said, "Lo, who sent you?" He did not answer. He said, "You will tell Lord Hadric Melvin that I will see him at the 3rd hour after noon today. You will tell him I will see him alone. Tell him not to bring a parchment." He bowed. He said, "You will tell him also that he is not to come within 30 paces of this courtyard again." He bowed again. He said, "Go." Both men went. No bronze wolf had been with them. They had not brought a wolf to the carver's courtyard. They had had the small instinct that a wolf laid down at the iron gate of the carver's courtyard would not have followed them in. When the two men were gone, the king bent and picked up the iron-banded chest. He carried it to the foot of the great name stone. He set it down at the foot of the stone with the care of a man who had carried his father's sword out of the field once and had set it down with the same care. He stood up. He turned to her. He said, "Lo, Sela," she said, "Your Grace." He said, "Forgive them." She said, "You have not done a thing that needs forgiveness, Your Grace." He said, "A king's hold is a king's responsibility. 2 of my own subjects came at the chisels of my carver. I am sorry." She said, "Your Grace?" He said, "I have something I have been meaning to give you for 3 years." He stood looking at her for a long count. Then he walked across the courtyard to the wide, flat step of the inner door, and he stooped, and he reached behind the step into a small recess in the stone wall that she had never noticed in 13 years of working in this courtyard, and he drew out a second iron-bound chest, smaller than the one Heidric's men had brought, lower, deeper, made of dark oiled oak, with a single plain iron clasp. He carried it across to her. He set it on the iron-bound stool beside her parchment. He said, "Lo, open it." She opened it. Inside were 6 chisels. They were laid in a long bed of dark blue wool, each chisel in its own slot. They were of finer iron than her grandmother's. The handles were turned ashwood, the same close-grain ashwood as her grandmother's old maul. The cutting edges were honed to a fineness she could see across 2 hands' breadths. There was an ashwood maul, new, the grip wrapped in fine, soft leather. There was a wax paper of fine, pale sand. There was a small leather wristband, narrower than her old one, and at the inside of the wristband, sewn into the leather in fine, pale silk, was a single letter, a small W for Whitestone. She did not say anything for a long count. He said, "Lo, I had them made 3 years ago. I had them made by Vren, who is the smith my father had make my brother's first sword. I have kept them in the recess of the courtyard step under a wax cloth for 3 years. I knew this day would come. Heidric has been wanting to break your line for 2 years. I knew. I did not warn you because I did not want you to know that a king of yours had been waiting for such a day. I did not want to make you carve under that knowing. I am sorry I did not warn you." She did not say anything. She lifted the smallest chisel out of its slot. She balanced it across her right palm. The weight came true at the second finger. The edge sat clean. She said, "Lo, Vren did good work. He said he worked from the chisels you keep on your wall." Mira showed them to him at the year end, 3 winters back. Mira did not know I had asked her. I am sorry for that also. She turned her head. Mira was at the iron door of the hut. Mira had her eyes wide. Mira had not known. Sela said, "Lo to Mira, you are not in trouble." Mira said, "Lo, I did not know." Sela said, "I know you did not know." She turned back to the chest. She put the smallest chisel back in its slot. She closed the lid of the chest. She laid her hand on the lid. She said, "Lo, Your Grace." He said, "Yes." She said, "A carver does not take a chisel from a king." He said, "This is not a chisel from a king. It is a chisel from a man who has watched his carver work for 14 days and has wanted, every single one of those days, to put a tool in her hand that would not crack." She was quiet for a long count. She said, "Lo, tell Vren, when you next see him, that the seat balance at the second finger is the best I have held. He said, I will tell him. She said, Lo, and bring me the new maul. I will work the rest of this list with the new chisels. He said, as your carver wills. He brought her the new maul. She took it. She knelt at her work line. She picked the medium chisel of the new set out of the chest. She tested its edge against the back of her thumbnail. The test her grandmother had taught her at 12. The edge held. She said low, just above the level of the stone, Nin, daughter of Helva. She set the new chisel edge to the slate. She cut. Her cut was clean. Her new chisel went into the slate like a knife into apple flesh. She had to ease the angle a quarter turn higher to keep the bite even. The chisel was that fine. By the 3rd hour after noon, the king had gone to his audience with Heidr. By the 4th hour, the Chamberlain Larson had come to Sela's stone hut at the iron door and had said, Lo, with his good eye on her face and his old grey wolf bark at his heel, Lord Heidr will be at his country seat at first light tomorrow, and he will not return to Heidr in this reign. Sela said, Lo. Thank you, Larson. Larson said, There is news from the South Pass also. She said, Yes. Larson said, A column of 700 South Blades has come up through the high pass. The captains have ridden out tonight. The king will ride at first light. Sela said, Arn of Hael. Larson said, The king has Arn at his right shoulder. Sela said, How many men? Larson said, 83. Sela said, I will be at the stone when the rolls come. Larson said, I will bring them in my own hand. He bowed. He went. She set the chisel down on the iron-bound stool. She knelt at the foot of the great name stone. She laid her right hand against the slate at the height of her knee, the morning prayer of her line, and she held it there for a count of 100. She did not weep. A carver did not weep on the work line. She picked the chisel back up. She cut the next letter. He rode at first light. Sela was at the stone before he rode. She heard the horses gather at the outer gate in the pre-dawn dark. She heard the iron of bridles and the soft, heavy stamp of the war mounts on the cobble. She heard the captain's voice, Arn of Hael, the foster brother, the one whose name had nearly gone on the slate 2 weeks back, calling the count of the column at the gate. 83. Her hand at her work line did not falter at the count. A carver who flinched at a number was a carver who did not last. At the first thin gray, she heard Soren, the dark gray wolf, come across the courtyard and lay himself for a count of 3 at the foot of her work stool. And she heard a man's footstep behind her, and she did not turn. He said, Lo, Sela. She did not turn. She finished the heel of the letter she was on. She set the chisel down. She stood up. She turned. He was in the war cloak, heavy charcoal wool, the same deep burgundy lining, but doubled at the shoulder for an arm guard. He had a small short sword at the left hip and a smaller bone-handled belt knife at the right. His hair was loose tied at the nape with a fresh leather cord. His dark hazel eyes were steady. The gold flecks in them were lifted by the dawn. She said, Lo, your grace. He said, Lo, I will not have a thing of yours go undone in my absence. The chisel chest is yours. The hut is yours. The new wristband is yours. The chamberlain has the seat in council until I come back. If I do not come back, the chamberlain has the seat for the year of mourning. After that, the inner march will sit in council to choose the next of the line. She said, Lo, you will come back. He said, I will if I can, Sela. He was quiet for a count of 3. He said, Lo, Aaron rides with me at my right. She said, Yes. He said, If a name comes to you in the next fortnight that includes mine, carve it slow. She said, I carve them all slow. He said, Slower, for me. She said, As your carver wills. He looked at her for a long count. He said, Lo, Sela. She said, Yes. He said, There are 2 things in the small recess of the courtyard step that you will need to know about. The first is the chisel chest, which you have already. The second is a folded parchment, which I will not tell you the meaning of unless I come back. If I come back, I will speak of it. If I do not, leave it where it is. It is for me, not for you. She said, Lo, your grace. He said, And the bread. She said, The bread. He said, I have told the kitchen boy to bring it. He will bring it before light each morning. He is a small, fair-haired boy of 9 called Tib. He has been told that he must lay it on the threshold without knocking. I have told him also that he must not stay. She said, As your grace wills. He turned. He laid his right hand on Sorin's neck. Sorin did not stand. He said, Lo, Sorin stays. She said, Your grace. He said, He will not leave the courtyard. He will not eat from anyone's hand but yours and the chamberlain's. I have told him. She said, He is your wolf. He said, He is the king's wolf. The carver of the name's stone is a king's office. He is the king's wolf, and he is hers. He bent, slowly, gravely, on Wolf, and laid his hand once on the dark gray crown of Sorin's head. He did not say anything to the wolf that she could hear. The wolf did not move. He stood. He did not touch her hand. He did not touch her sleeve. He turned. He walked out by the iron gate of the courtyard. She stood at the stone. All 83 rode out. She heard them go down the cobble of the outer market in the still of the early hour, and the hooves went small, and the small gray light of the dawn began to climb the upper edge of the name stone. And Sorin, the dark gray wolf, laid himself across her work line at the foot of the slate, and she knelt down beside him, and she laid her hand for a count of 12 on the wolf's pale belly, the way her grandmother had laid a hand on the wolf of a fallen carver's daughter once, and she said, Lo, you are at your work, Sorin. So am I. She picked up the chisel. She cut the next letter. For 7 days, she did not see anyone except Mira and the chamberlain Larson and the small, fair-haired kitchen boy Tib, who came in at the iron gate of the courtyard before light each morning with a small linen-wrapped loaf of pale bread and laid it on the flat stone of her threshold and did not stay. Sorin did not eat from Tib's hand. Sela ate. Mira ate. On the 8th morning, Larson came at the 2nd hour after dawn. His face had gone the long, quiet, still way it went when a roll had come in. He had the parchment in his right hand. His old gray wolf bark was at his left side. He said low before he reached the foot of the stone, He is alive. The king is alive. Wounded. Not gravely. He is at the inner gate now. They have carried him in. She said low, Aaron. Larson said low. Aaron of Hael fell at the 2nd day. The captains carried him down on the 3rd. She said, How many? Larson said, 83 rode out. 12 came back. The other men are on the rolls. She said, 71 names. Larson said, Yes. He laid the parchment on the iron-bound stool. He did not stay. She did not weep. A carver did not weep on the work line. She read the parchment. She read each name twice, once with her eye, once with her finger laid flat over the letters of the parchment. A 71st name was Aaron of Hael, captain, foster brother of Corvan Hael, son of Hael of the Inner Mark, and Mara of the Inner Mark. She laid the parchment back on the iron-bound stool. She knelt at her work line. She picked the chisel. She said, Lo, Bren of Stonewatch. She cut. For 13 days she carved. She carved by daylight. She carved by lamplight when the day went down. She carved by candle when the lamp oil ran low. On the 11th night the candle went down, and the moon was high above the courtyard, and she carved by moonlight. She did not stop for meals. Mira brought her bowls. She ate at the stone, the bowl on the iron-bound stool beside the parchment, the chisel set down for the count of 30 between mouthfuls. She did not stop for water. Mira brought her cup. She drank standing at the stone. She did not stop for sleep. She slept 3 hours of every 14, on the stone hut floor, on the straw that Mira pulled out for her at midnight. With Sorin the dark gray wolf laid across her feet, and the inside of the hut warm with the brazier and the long, deep dark of the night against the slit window. Her right shoulder went stiff at the 3rd day. She rebalanced the chisel strap with the new wristband. She worked through. On the 7th day, the chisel hand cramped at the 2nd finger, and she had to lay down the medium and pick up the fine. She worked through. On the 10th day, she did not choose cedar bark. That was a beer walker's trick, not a carver's. But she did the carver's trick, which was to take the small, soft pouch of fine, pale sand at her belt and rub a pinch of the sand between her 2 palms for the count of 20. The sand cleared the heat from the chisel hand. Her grandmother had taught her at 15. On the 12th day, she came to the 70th name. She finished it at the 2nd hour past the moon's rise. She sat back on her heels. A 71st name was at the bottom of the parchment. She read it. She had been reading it every time she had taken up the parchment, every name, every day of the 13, because a carver did not skip ahead to a name. And she had not skipped ahead, but she had also been carrying the 71st name in her chest for 13 days, and the 71st name was the one she had been waiting to come up to. She said, Lo, just above the level of the stone. Aaron of Hael, captain, foster brother of Corvan Hael, son of Hael of the inner mark, and Mara of the inner mark. She set the chisel edge to the slate. She cut the A, she cut the R, she cut the Y, she cut the N, she cut the comma, she did the long word, captain, slow. CAPTAIN. Each letter took her 3/4 of an hour. She did the foster, she did the brother, she did the of, she did the Corvan, she did the Hael, she did the comma again, she did the son, she did the of, she did the Hael, she did the of, she did the inner, she did the hyphen, she did the mark, she did the and, she did the Mara, she did the of, she did the inner, she did the hyphen, she did the mark. She finished the last letter at the third dawn. A first thin gray of the dawn was just beginning to touch the upper edge of the great name stone. She set the chisel down on the iron-bound stool. She set the maul down beside it. She stood up. She took her right thumb across the back of her hand to clean the dust. She knelt at the foot of the stone. She laid her right hand against the slate at the height of her knee, the morning prayer of her line, and she held it there for a count of 100. She did not weep at the stone. She stood up. She walked across the 8 paces of courtyard to the iron door of the stone hut. Soren walked beside her. She pushed the door of the hut open. She walked to the long bench. She unbuckled the chest strap of the chisel pouches. She laid it on the bench. She unbuckled the wide leather wristband. She laid it beside the strap. She unbuckled the work apron. She let it fall. She lay down on the straw of the pallet. She closed her eyes. She did not weep. She slept. A long time later, she did not know how long, she heard the iron door of the courtyard open. She heard a slow, heavy step come across the 8 paces of stone. She heard the step come to the threshold of the hut. She heard the step come into the hut. She heard the step come to the foot of the pallet. She opened her eyes. He was kneeling at the foot of the pallet. He had his cloak. He had not been wearing the war cloak. He had been wearing the charcoal wool with the deep burgundy lining. He had a thin line of fresh stitching at the right shoulder where his cloak had been mended. There was a small, fresh white line at the edge of his beard at the jaw, the kind of small, fresh line a man had when a clean cut had healed in the 2nd week. His dark hazel eyes had gone darker than she had seen them, in the way they went in cold. He said, "Lo, Sela." She said, "Lo, your grace." He said, "You finished." She said, "At the 3rd dawn." He said, "I came at the 3rd dawn. I came across the courtyard at the 2nd hour. I saw the 71st name. I saw it whole." She said, "Yes." He said, "You will not be on the work line tomorrow." She said, "There may be a list." He said, "There may be no list. The chamberlain will not bring you a list for 10 days. I have asked him. The lower march has buried its own. The high pass has buried its own. There is nothing on the rolls for 10 days. She said, "Lo, your grace." He said, "You are coming with me." She said, "Where?" He said, "Up the inner stair." She said, "I cannot." He said, "You cannot stand. I know." He laid one arm under her shoulders, careful at the right one because he had been a soldier king, and he knew the shoulder of a worker that had carved for 13 days, and he laid one arm under her knees, and he lifted her. She did not fight him. She laid her head against the wool of his shoulder. He carried her out of the hut. He carried her across the 8 paces of courtyard. Soren walked beside him. Mira came to the iron door of the hut with her hands held over her mouth. He carried her through the inner door. He carried her up the inner stair. He carried her along the long upper hall. He carried her into a long, low chamber on the 2nd floor with a wide hearth and a deep wooden bed and a heavy iron-bound oak chest at the foot of the bed. He laid her on the bed. He pulled a heavy wool blanket up to her collarbone. She turned her head a little to the side, the way she did when she was estimating a clear patch of stone. She looked at the long wall opposite the bed. Set into the stone of the wall itself was a head-high slab of deep obsidian black stone. 3 names were carved on it. There was a 4th space, empty. She did not speak for a long count. He sat on the stool at the head of the bed. He did not look at the obsidian black stone on the long wall. He had been looking at it for 13 days, every morning before he came down to the courtyard step in the small hour, every evening when he came back up the inner stair, and he did not need to look at it now. He looked at her face. She read the 3 names on the stone first. She read them in the slow, careful way of a carver who could not pass a name without tasting the cut. Kiernan Hael, Brena Hael, Calder Hael. Then she read the 4th name, the new one, Sela of Whitestone. His cuts were uneven. They went deep at the start of each stroke and shallow at the end. The serifs were not consistent. The S leaned a finger's width. The H of Whitestone had a heel that did not quite meet its second leg. The letters were the size her grandmother had taught her, was the king line size, a thumb's breadth tall, but they had been cut by someone whose hand had not done this work before, and they showed it. It was the worst carving she had ever seen on a king's stone. She did not say so for a long count. She said, "Lo, how long?" He said, 13 days. She said, "You started the day you rode out." He said, "I started the night before. I woke at the 3rd hour. I came up the inner stair with a candle. I put the candle on the chest at the foot of the bed. I took the chisels, my own. I had had Vren make me a small set the same year I had your set made. And I cut the first letter of your name." He said, "I cut the S." He said, "I had to do it that hour because I knew if I rode out without having begun your name on this stone, I might not come back. And the stone would have 3 names on it, and the 4th would not be there. I would not have that. I would not have the line of my house go forward without your name on the stone of my house." She did not say anything. He said, "Lo, I came back at the 2nd day with the rest of the column. I went out to bury Aaron at the elder yew on the north slope, the way Aaron had asked. I came back at the 3rd day. I bathed. I had my shoulder seen. I came up the inner stair. I cut the E." He said, "I cut a letter every day. Some days I cut 2. Some days I had to come up here twice because my hand had begun to know the shape and was getting too quick, and I knew you would have told me to slow down, and I went away and came back later." He said, "I finished the W of Whitestone at the 3rd hour of the night before last. I have been waiting since then for you to come up the inner stair. I knew you would not come up the inner stair until you had finished Aaron. I knew when you finished Aaron because you finished my brother on the great stone 6 years ago at the same hour of the same kind of dawn. I was at the courtyard step then, behind the kitchen, and I saw you finish, and I never spoke of it. I knew." He said, "I came down the inner stair this morning when the chamberlain told me you had laid the chisel down. I came across the courtyard. I came into your hut. I lifted you." He said, "Lo, I am sorry I did not ask." She said, "Lo, a king does not ask a carver to come up an inner stair, your grace." He said, "A king does for a Sela of Whitestone." She did not answer. She turned her head back to the obsidian black stone on the long wall. She looked at the 4 names again. She said, "Lo, why my name on a king's bloodstone?" He said, "Because every name on the great name's stone is a name you carved." He said, "You carved my father. You did not carve him with your own chisel. Your grandmother did. But a name is carved by the line of the carver, and the line of the carver is yours." He said, "You carved my mother in the same way." He said, "You carved my brother with your own chisel 6 years ago. You were 20. You did not have time to carve him slow. You carved him slow anyway. He is at the highest reach of your chisel arm in the upper register. He has the upper edge of his upper letters touching the lower edge of the king line that runs above. You told me this was an accident of the patch. It was not. You knew that I would come at the 3rd hour of the night and look for him by feel, and you set him where I could find him without a candle." She did not answer. He said, "There is no name on that great stone that did not come through your hand. You have carved 4,371 names. You have carved every house in this realm. You have carved my house. You have carved your own house." He said, "There is one name in this kingdom that I will not let your hand carve. Yours." He said, "Lo, and so this stone of my house, has 4 names. The first 3 are yours. The 4th I had to do, because the 4th I would not let anyone else do." She did not answer for a count of 40. She put her right hand out from under the heavy wool blanket. He did not take it. She knew he would not. A carver's hand belonged to the chisel, and a king did not take a carver's hand at her own bedside in his own solar. She held her hand up toward the stone on the long wall. He understood. He stood. He went to the wall. He laid the back of his hand against the obsidian at the height of her name. He waited. She said, "Lo, bring it nearer, your grace." He said, "Lo, I cannot bring the wall nearer." She said, "Lo, then carry me to the wall." He came to the bed. He laid one arm under her shoulders and one arm under her knees. He lifted her again. He carried her the 4 paces from the bed to the wall. He stood her on her own bare feet, on the cold stone of the floor, with one of his arms still under her at the small of her back to keep her standing. She laid her right hand on her own name in the obsidian. She felt the cuts, an S that leaned. The E had a serif uneven by the width of a hair. The L was deep at the head and shallow at the foot. The first A had a slight skew in the crossbar. The second A was cleaner. He had begun to learn by the second A. She traced the letters with her fingertip. She traced the W. She traced the H, she traced the I, she traced the T, she traced the E, she traced the S, she traced the second T, she traced the O, she traced the N, she traced the E. His serifs of Whitestone did not match each other. He had not yet found his rhythm with the smaller chisel by the time he got to the Whitestone. The serifs were doing their best. She kept her hand on the stone for a long count. She said low, against his shoulder, "It is the worst carving I have ever seen on a king's stone." He said low, "I know." She said low, "It is the only carving I will ever look at without finding the work to fix." He said low, "Sela." She said low, "There is nothing here I would change. Not the lean of the S, not the hair on the E, not the W, none of it, not by a fingernail." He said low, "Thank you." She said low, "Your Grace, may I sleep?" He said low, "Yes." He carried her back to the bed. He laid her down. He pulled the heavy wool blanket up to her collarbone again. He sat on the stool at the head of the bed. She slept. She slept the rest of that day and the night that followed. She woke at the second dawn. He was on the stool. He had not slept. The fire was low. Soren, the dark gray wolf, was at the foot of the bed. She stayed 3 days in the king's solar. On the 4th day, she stood at the door of the solar and asked, "Lo, Your Grace, may I go down?" He said low, "Yes." She said low, "I will be back." He said low, "I know." She walked down the inner stair. She walked through the long upper hall. She walked through the inner door. She walked across the 8 paces of courtyard. She pushed the iron door of the stone hut open. Mira was at the bench. Mira had laid out the new chisel chest. Mira had laid the small wooden bowl beside it. Mira had laid the wide leather wristband at the head of the bench. Mira had laid the chest strap of the chisel pouches across it. Mira had not touched her grandmother's old ashwood maul. The grandmother's maul was where it always slept, at the head of the bench on the right. Mira did not turn. Mira said low, "There is a parchment from the chamberlain." Sela said, "How many?" Mira said, 6, from the upper river. They came down yesterday. Sela said, "I will be at the stone before light tomorrow." Mira said, "Yes." Sela went to the bench. She laid her hand on the new chisel chest. She laid her hand on her grandmother's maul. She laid her hand on the practice stone in the corner where Mira's first vertical line was. She laid her hand on the iron door of the brazier. She laid her hand on the long bench. Her hut was hers. Her line was hers. In the very early gray of the dawn, the next morning she came out of the iron door of the stone hut. She carried her grandmother's maul in her left hand and the medium chisel of the new set in her right. Soren, the dark gray wolf, followed her. She walked the 8 paces between her door and the foot of the great name stone. Her boots made a small, soft sound on the worn flagstones. She stopped at the foot of the stone. She laid her right hand flat against the slate at the height of her own knee. She held it there for a count of 20. Then she stepped back. She turned her head a little to the side, the way she did when she was estimating the next clear patch of stone. The next clear patch was at the level of her own waist. On the line below the 71st name of the last campaign, Aaron of Hael, captain, foster brother of Corvan Hael, and the patch was wide enough for 9 names if she carved generous. She would carve generous. She knelt at her work line. She picked up the chisel. Across the courtyard, on the wide, flat step of the inner door, a tall man with shoulder-length dark brown hair, loose-tied at the nape, in a charcoal wool cloak lined deep burgundy, with a small linen-wrapped loaf in his hand, and his back set against the warm stone of the wall, and his knees up and his cloak pooled around his boots, sat down without speaking. Soren laid himself across his man's feet. She laid the chisel edge to the slate. She said low, just above the level of the stone, "Bren of Stonewatch." Before the sun touched the upper edge of the great name stone, Sela of Whitestone was already cutting.